He called the black bricklayer just muscle, but when the CEO walked in, the truth crushed him like a wrecking ball. Before dawn broke over San Francisco, Elias Moore was already at the Orion Heights construction site, a 32-story tower rising from the city's heart. Dust on his boots, sweat in his shirt, and scars on his hands, he was the first to lay bricks for this colossal project. No one ever asked about his degrees because he had none. But no one could deny Elias understood buildings like he understood his own heartbeat. As the team gathered for a progress meeting, a low, commanding voice echoed from the center. "We're adjusting the timeline. Cut material use on the east wing. Maximize savings." That voice belonged to Grant Kellerman, the newly appointed chief engineer. Shirt crisp, tie sharp, and shoes untouched by even a grain of dust, he walked as if the ground itself bent to his will. Elias stepped forward slowly. "I'm concerned about the soil on the east side. It's weaker than the models suggest, without reinforcement." "Who are you?" Grant cut him off, smirking. "Bricklayers should focus on mortar. Leave engineering to the professionals." A silence fell, but beneath it a storm was quietly brewing, one that would crack more than concrete. It was as if a stone had shattered still water. The makeshift room froze. The younger engineers exchanged glances. Some stifled laughter. Others looked away uneasy. Grant stepped closer, his voice sharper. "We don't pay laborers to think. We pay them to follow orders." Elias didn't budge. His gaze didn't tremble. There was no fire in his eyes, just something deeper, steady, unshakable. "With all due respect," he said calmly, "I brought it up because I've seen foundations like this fail before." Grant scoffed. "Congratulations. Looks like we've got ourselves a structural engineer in a hard hat. Shall we print his Stanford diploma now?" Laughter erupted, nervous, mocking, empty. Elias clenched his jaw but showed no emotion. He looked around, eyes avoiding his, a young intern staring at the floor, wishing to disappear. Grant leaned in closer, voice low and venomous. "If you want to keep your job, Jefferson, stick to the trowel and leave the math to those who know it." Elias smiled faintly, not with fear, not with submission, but with the quiet knowing of a man who held a truth no one else yet saw. "Understood," he said. "Just thought someone should mention it." Then he walked out, and the air behind him closed like a curtain. By midday, the sun scorched the steel beams of Orion Heights. Grant stood at the edge of the platform, barking out commands louder than usual, not out of confidence, but to drown out the silence that trailed behind Elias's quiet exit. "We're shaving 3 days off this timeline. Pour the south slab by Thursday. If the forecast says rain, cover it. No excuses, just at execution." But no one nodded. The site buzzed, yet something had shifted. Whispers filled the shadows. Eyes darted. Feet moved faster as if a storm approached. Elias was nowhere in sight. At the far end of the site, beneath the shadow of scaffolding, he sat quietly on a concrete block. His fingers moved across an old phone screen. One short message. No urgency. No visible retaliation. Just one final move on the chessboard. 10 minutes later, Grant's phone buzzed. One alert, one name. Emergency site meeting. Orion president arriving in 15 minutes. The temperature dropped. Engineers adjusted their ties. Supervisors wiped sweat from their necks. Everyone moved like the king was coming. No one noticed the faint smirk that had returned to Elias's lips because the trap had just sprung. Grant straightened his tie. Fake confidence returned to his spine. "Get this site spotless," he barked. Entrance cleared, display boards set up. "Where's the updated foundation report?" He leaned toward his assistant and whispered, "Why's the old man coming here in person? Just says Mr. Summers wants to review the project firsthand." Grant forced a laugh. Let's hope he likes the cost savings. But his eyes betrayed him, restless, scanning the site like a general sensing defeat. 15 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. And then came the sound, deep smooth, of a black Range Rover entering the lot. Its glossy surface reflected sunlight like a mirror slicing through tension. The site froze. The front door opened. A tall man in a dark suit stepped out security. Then from the back emerged a middle-aged black man, his suit impeccably tailored, his steps unhurried, his briefcase swinging at his side like it belonged there because it did. Grant stepped forward, arm outstretched, smile forced. "Mr. Summers, what an honor." "We're perfectly on schedule." The man raised a hand, calm, cold. "I believe we've met," he said. Grant blinked. "I'm sorry, Mum. My name," the man said, "is Elias Jackson Summers." Grant paled. The smile collapsed from his lips. His hand hung in the air, forgotten. The whispers began behind him. A clipboard clattered to the ground. A young engineer mouthed, "No way." "You're the bricklayer," Grant muttered, barely able to breathe. Elias nodded, and also the founder and CEO of Orion Developments. The silence didn't just fall, it detonated. Elias stood firm, not angry, not boastful, just unshakably present. He turned toward the engineers, the laborers, the supervisors watching with wide eyes. "I warned about the East Foundation this morning. I was ignored, mocked. Not because I was wrong, but because of what I wore. Because I didn't walk in here with a title." He looked directly at Grant. "And because of that arrogance, you nearly compromised the integrity of this entire building." Grant's voice cracked. "I didn't know." Elias interrupted, his tone cutting through bone. "You didn't listen." A long pause. Then in a voice barely louder than a whisper but heavier than steel, "And in construction, not listening kills." He turned to the crew. 15 minutes. Main trailer. Bring every blueprint, every cost log, every decision made in the last 3 months. The reckoning had begun. Grant stood motionless, drenched in cold sweat. His polished image, his posture, his prestige, crumbled with each second of silence. Elias, the man he had publicly humiliated, now commanded the entire room with quiet certainty. "You didn't just insult me," Elias said, voice unwavering. "You silenced every worker here. The ones who build your vision with their hands and who see danger long before the blueprints do." A young engineer in the corner raised his hand, nervously. "Mr. Summers, I overheard Mr. Elias this morning. He warned about the foundation crack. But I was afraid to speak up." Elias turned, his face softening. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. From now on at Orion, every voice matters." Around the room, weathered hands twitched. Faces once hardened by habit began to soften. For the first time, they saw a leader who didn't just issue orders, but stood shoulder to shoulder with them. And for the first time, they believed they were more than just labor. They were the soul of the structure. And the man they had watched mix mortar was now giving them something stronger than concrete dignity. 30 minutes later, a war room took shape inside the main trailer. Blueprints, cost reports, inspection, logs all spread out like evidence at a courtroom trial. And Elias sat at the head, not as a tyrant, but as the calm eye of the storm. He didn't shout, he didn't accuse, but every word landed like a gavel. "Here," he pointed, "you approve substituting lower-grade steel in the eastern column structure." Why, Grant's voice trembled. I wanted to reduce material costs. We were over budget and behind schedule." Elias looked up. "At what cost, Grant? A building's safety? Human lives, or the soul of a company I built with calloused hands and sleepless nights?" A compliance auditor stood. "We found 14 violations, including falsified stress test data and multiple ignored warnings." No one defended Grant. No one even looked him in the eye. Because in that moment, it was clear the real weakness wasn't in the steel beams. It was in the pride that blinded a man to truth delivered in a dusty shirt by a man they all thought was just a worker. But that worker had just exposed the rot at the foundation of power. Elias placed the pen down on the table. "I know your type, Grant," he said, voice calm. "I used to be you. Once upon a time, I thought authority meant being above correction. That silence meant agreement. That fear kept people efficient." He stood, opening a sealed envelope. "Here are your two options. First, immediate termination with legal review for gross negligence. Second, voluntary resignation and 6 months of community service teaching construction to underserved youth." Grant sat motionless. His eyes burned not from anger, but the sharp, slow sting of realization. He hadn't just lost a title. He'd lost the trust of every person who ever looked up at the scaffolding and believed someone competent was in charge. Outside, the sound of hammers and drills still echoed. But something deeper had shifted. The men and women who'd watched one of their own be silenced now stood taller. They didn't need permission to feel proud. They finally had a leader who saw them. And the man who once laughed at a dusty hand now had to learn how to extend his own with humility. Because sometimes the most powerful kind of leadership is learned after you fall. That afternoon, Elias climbed a small steel platform in the middle of the worksite. The sunset burned orange against the rising tower behind him. Hundreds of workers, engineers, and managers stood gathered below. He wore no blazer, just a dusty work shirt and the same old boots from day one. I was asked why the CEO of Orion would pose as a bricklayer. Elias began, his voice carried by the wind. It wasn't to test anyone. It was to remind myself what this company is built on, not profits or prestige, but people. He paused, letting silence do what words couldn't. We've built walls tall enough to touch the sky. But the most dangerous walls are the ones we build between each other, between collars blue and white, between experience and assumption. He looked across the crowd at the young intern who looked up in awe, the veteran foreman holding back tears, and yes, even at Grant, now standing quietly among them. Elias raised a hand. From today forward at Orion, no job is too small to be heard, and no voice is too low to matter. And for the first time, applause didn't just echo. It roared because it came from the soul. Grant left the site with no fanfare, just a cardboard box in his arms and a storm inside his chest. No jeers, no mocking, only a quiet corridor of stairs, not filled with hate, but something worse, pity. At the gate, Elias watched him go, not to gloat, but to reflect. Because sometimes the greatest victory is the lesson your enemy is forced to carry home. The next morning, Elias returned not in a suit, but in that same work shirt, calloused hands, holding a trowel. He walked among the crew, not above them. A young worker named Leo whispered, "You're really back in uniform, sir." Elias smiled, dipping his trowel into mortar. "I never took it off." And with that, he began laying bricks, once again, one layer at a time. The same hands that had once been laughed at were now laying the foundation, not just for a tower, but for something deeper. A culture, a truth. A future built on respect, because when a man returns to the ground he once stood upon, not as a boss, but as a brother, that's when real change begins. The next morning, before the horn signaled the start of the day, Elias was already on site. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore work gloves, boots smeared in dried mortar, and a faded shirt clinging to his back. The same as always. As workers filed in, Leo, a young laborer who had watched Elias get humiliated, approached him, hesitant. "Sir, are you really the founder of Orion? Why are you still mixing cement with us?" Elias paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "See this mix?" he said, gesturing to the mortar. "If it's wrong, the bricks don't hold. No matter how pretty the facade, the whole thing will collapse." Leo looked at him, puzzled. "It's the same with people," Elias continued. "Without trust holding us together, the building means nothing." Leo didn't say another word, but the respect in his eyes said more than 1,000 speeches. That day, Elias wasn't teaching structural integrity. He was living it. And for the first time, many realized the dust on his shirt didn't make him less. It made him real. Later that day, Elias stepped into a small office at the edge of the site to check messages. Among the usual emails and updates, one subject line made him pause. "Collaboration inquiry, Southridge Institute of Technology." He answered the call. "Mr. Summers," came a measured voice, "we've heard about your training initiative for at-risk youth. We'd like to partner if you're still looking for instructors and infrastructure." Elias leaned back, heart stirred. "I'm not building a program for a peer," he said. "I want something real. A place where kids who never saw themselves in hard hats or blueprints can feel like they belong." The voice on this other end softened. "That's exactly why we're calling." As the call ended, Elias stared out the dusty window at the crew moving below. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a lone bricklayer fighting uphill. He was building something bigger than himself. A second chance not just for others, but for the world that had forgotten how to listen. A week later, amidst the hum of machinery and clatter of steel, a familiar but unexpected figure appeared at the site gate. Grant Kellerman. Shirt untucked, shoulders lower, eyes less certain. Walter, the veteran foreman, spotted him first. "What's he doing here?" he muttered. Grant stepped forward holding a plain bag. "I'm not here to reclaim my title," he said. "I'm here to ask if I can assist with the training program." "I want to teach," Walter frowned. "You think it's that easy? To walk back in after all that?" A voice interrupted gently. Let him speak. It was Elias standing just behind, calm, unshaken. You ready to listen, Grant? He asked. Grant nodded. I don't know everything, but I'm ready to learn. Elias didn't smile. Not yet, but his eyes held something stronger, recognition. Then you'll start at the back of the class, beside the same people you once ignored, and with that a door that had once slammed shut, opened, not out of pity, but because every man deserves the chance to rebuild brick by brick. Inside a dim classroom tucked at the far end of the site, Grant stood nervously before a dozen young trainees. Most hadn't finished high school. Some hadn't seen a classroom in years, but all of them stared with weedy, skeptical eyes. Today's lesson, load-bearing walls. Grant scribbled formulas across the board. He explained the calculations, the ratios, the safety factors. And then a student raised his hand. Malik, just 17. Quiet but sharp. Mr. Grant, what if the numbers in the book are wrong? The room fell quiet. Months ago, Grant would have scoffed, corrected him, asserted his authority, but not today. He looked at Malik's sketch, studied the alternative solution. Then he did something he'd never done before. He nodded. You're right to question. Let's work through this together. A murmur rippled through the room in respect. Grant didn't just teach that day. He learned. Because true knowledge isn't about being right. It's about knowing when to stop talking and start listening. Outside that classroom, Elias stood quietly by the door, listening not to the lecture but to the stillness that comes when something important shifts. Walter joined him, arms crossed. You really believe that man can change? Elias didn't answer right away. His gaze lingered on Grant, who now knelt beside Malik, helping him measure angles with chalk and string. I don't need him to be perfect, Elias finally said. I just need him to understand that humility builds stronger structures than pride ever could. Walter followed his gaze, then looked up at a new sign painted across the far wall. A building stands because of its bricks. A team stands because of its respect. That evening, as the sun dipped behind Orion Heights, Elias touched the freshly painted words. They were more than decoration. They were a promise, not of perfection, but of a future where voices weren't measured by rank, but by the courage to be heard. That afternoon, Elias walked into the break room where workers sat sharing boxed lunches on crates and concrete ledges. No reserved chairs, no name tags, just people. He sat down beside Marlon, the older worker with more years in scaffolding than anyone else. Marlon looked over with teary eyes. You don't know what it meant. To see someone like us stand up and be heard. Elias took a spoonful of rice, smiled gently. I know, I've sat in your spot. I've eaten cold meals while being talked about like I wasn't even in the room. Marlon lowered his eyes. But not anymore. Now they listen. Elias nodded slowly. No one's born to be invisible, Marlon. We're all just waiting for someone to see us. And in that dusty, humble space with calloused hands and tired shoulders, they didn't talk about metrics or safety margins. They talked about pride, about dignity, about being more than a number on a payroll. For the first time, their words weren't whispers. They were bricks in a new kind of foundation. The next morning, the top floor of Orion's headquarters filled with board members. Polished suits, sleek laptops, clean coffee cups. They were here to hear about expansion, not stories. But Elias stood without slides or charts. He told them about the site, about the silence after humiliation, about the slow, defiant rise of voices that had once been buried under concrete and condescension. A young executive cleared his throat. With all due respect, Mr. Summers, emotions don't build revenue. Elias turned gaze calm. Neither do lawsuits, accidents, or broken trust. He took a brick from his bag. Scuffed, chipped, real. This built Orion, he said, holding it high. Not just the material, but the man behind it. The unheard worker who noticed the crack no one else did. He placed the brick gently on the table. When you build trust, loyalty follows. And with loyalty comes pride. And pride, gentlemen, is priceless. Silence followed. Not out of fear, but out of understanding, because in that moment, they weren't listening to a CEO. They were listening to the heartbeat of a company. Later that evening, Elias returned to his office. On his desk sat a plain envelope. No fancy seal, just his name scribbled in uneven pen. He opened it carefully. Inside, a handwritten letter from Grant. I'm not writing to ask for anything. I just wanted to say thank you, because you made me face the parts of myself I tried to bury beneath titles and pride. I used to think listening made me weak, but now I know it makes me human. If you'll allow it, I'd like to stay with the youth program, not for redemption, but because I see value there in them and maybe in me. Elias sat back in his chair. He didn't smile, but his chest rose just a little fuller. Forgiveness had never been the goal. Transformation was. And Grant, the man who once barked orders from a platform, now stood in the dirt, asking to teach. Not because he had to, but because he'd finally heard the voice inside himself. The Orion Heights structure neared completion. Its exterior shone under the golden light of dusk, but the real beauty was happening inside. A modest graduation was held on the third floor for the first class of construction trainees, no spotlight, just folding chairs, proud smiles, and firm handshakes. Grant handed a certificate to Malik, the teen who once questioned his teaching. Congratulations, he said, voice soft. Malik grinned. Thank you, sir. You taught me more than math. You taught me how to stand up for my ideas. Across the room, Elias watched from a distance, not as a leader, just a man witnessing growth. Around him, laughter mixed with the sound of boots scuffing concrete. Supervisors no longer barked, they asked. Interns no longer stayed silent, they spoke. The barriers that once divided the site had begun to crumble. Not from force, but from understanding. Because when one man lays down his pride and another picks up his voice, a wall falls. And in its place, a bridge is built. At the entrance of Orion Heights, a new plaque was quietly installed. No fanfare, no media, just brushed metal and bold engraving. We build with concrete and steel. But we stand on trust, humility, and the courage to listen. No name followed, but everyone knew who wrote it. That morning, Elias stood before it with Leo, Malik, Marlin, and yes, Grant by his side. I never wanted a legacy, Elias said. I wanted a place where no one had to raise their voice just to be heard. The wind swept gently across the site. The building loomed tall above them, a testament not just to construction, but to change. And as Elias walked away, his footsteps echoed with a truth deeper than the foundation beneath them. The strongest structures aren't made of steel. They're made of second chances. That evening, Elias returned home. In the corner of his garage sat an old wooden box worn by years and dust. He opened it slowly. Inside was a rusted, dented trowel, his first. He picked it up, hands trembling. Every scratch on its blade held a memory, sleepless nights under half-built roofs, insults disguised as orders, years of sweat poured into walls that others took credit for. He sat on the floor, trowel in hand, lost in the weight of it all. This tool had built homes, schools, even towers. But more than that, it had built character, pride, and perseverance no textbook could teach. He whispered into the silence, "Thank you for all the times they looked down on me. If they hadn't, I'd never have learned how to rise." The trowel wasn't just a symbol of work. It was the reminder that even the most humble hands could reshape the world if given the chance. 6 months later in the training center, tucked beneath Orion Heights, Grant was no longer just a guest. He stood before a room of wide-eyed trainees, a chalk-stained clipboard in one hand, and a calm confidence in his voice. No arrogance, just presence. Today's lesson, balance and bearing walls. Malik approached him after class. "Sir, I think your formula might be missing something. Want to check it with me?" Grant smiled, not a forced smile, but one earned. "Let's look at it together." They leaned over the diagram, working side by side, not as teacher and student, but as collaborators. From a distance, Elias watched through the glass window. He saw the way Grant listened now, the way his pride no longer entered the room before him. And he saw something even rarer, a man remade. Not by punishment, but by purpose. Because real strength wasn't in holding power over others. It was in kneeling down and offering your hand to lift someone else up. On the final day of the training program, the team gathered to take a group photo. No podium, no spotlight, just a sunlit wall, gray work shirts, and calloused hands. Grant stood beside Malik. Elias stood at the back, one hand resting gently on Leo's shoulder. Marlin folded his arms, chin lifted, eyes proud. When the photo was printed and framed, it was hung in the main hall of the training center. Beneath it, a single inscription: "We don't build with concrete, we build with each other." No names were listed, No titles mentioned, because this wasn't a picture about individuals. It was a portrait of growth, of redemption, of a team that learned to rise not by stepping over each other, but by standing together. And every person who walked by that photo paused and saw a little piece of themselves in it. One quiet Sunday afternoon, Elias sat on the rooftop terrace of Orion Heights with his granddaughter Maya. She pointed at the towering skyline. "Did you build that one?" Grandpa Elias nodded, a soft chuckle in his chest. "I helped. Were you the boss?" Elias thought for a moment, then shook his head. "I was the hands, the heart, and the voice they didn't hear, until they had to." She looked up at him confused. "Why didn't you yell at them then, or fire everyone?" He looked at her with eyes that had weathered decades. "Because revenge builds walls, Maya, but forgiveness builds bridges." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and as the sun dipped low over the city, Elias knew that what he had built wasn't just steel and stone. It was legacy, not carved in granite, but carried in the way people remember how you made them feel. At the grand opening of Orion's new training center, there were no corporate speeches or golden shovels, just a man in worn boots standing beside a blank wall. Elias raised a chisel and slowly carved each letter with his own hand. There are no small people, only unheard voices. When he stepped back, the crowd, workers, interns, leaders, students stood in silence. Walter leaned in. "You finally tore down the biggest wall, didn't you?" Elias smiled. "Which one?" "The one in their hearts. The one that said, 'You don't matter.'" They stood shoulder to shoulder, gazing up at the words etched in fresh stone. Behind them, laughter and conversation filled the air. The site, once divided, now pulsed with unity. There was no more us and them, just we. And as Elias looked out across the courtyard, he didn't see a training center. He saw a world rebuilt, not with iron and glass, but with trust, with redemption, and with the courage to listen to the ones who were once ignored, because the strongest foundation is always made of people. The loudest voice isn't always the wisest. Respect doesn't come from titles, it's earned through how you treat people, especially when you think no one's watching. And sometimes the people we overlook are the very ones holding up the world we live in.